Shalom Aleichem, everyone. Welcome to the Aliyah day. Good morning. Prayerfully, you're having a good day this morning as we are starting a brand new week and a brand new parashah. It's a double portion this week. Once again, we have Behar, Bechukotai, which are the last two parashot of the book of Leviticus. So this week, we will be ending the book of Leviticus, and then next week we will begin the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. So that's exciting. We get to come together and complete yet another, our third now, book of Torah together. So this being a double portion, we run into the challenge that we always have, which is the reading part. Today I'm going to spend some time looking at the introductions to this double portion, to read a little bit about Behar and the overall meaning to it, and a little bit about Bechukotai and the overall meaning to it as well. If you want to follow along and do the readings yourself, or the first and second reading anyway, you can do so by looking at your Humash on page 697. The reading is going to begin in chapter 25 of the book of Leviticus. It's going to begin in verse 1. And because it's a double portion, we have a little bit of a different flow. The first and second reading will go from chapter 25, verse 1, all the way in until verse 28, it looks like. 28. So chapter 25, verses 1 through 28, would be the first and second readings of Parashah, the double portion of Parashah, Behar Bechukotai. So we're going to, as I said, move in and look at some introductions to these this parashot and see what the sages and other commentators had to say about it. What are some general thoughts and themes to Behar Bechukotai? Let's begin with the Gutnik Chumash, the Gutnik Chumash introduction to Parashat Behar. We'll see what we have to say here, then we'll jump to the introduction as brought down from the Kehot Tumash and go from there. It says, by the way, for some reason I don't have the live chat on my end is not working. I don't know if it's working on your end, but if you ask a question or something like that or make a comment, for some reason I'm not able to see it. So that's kind of sad. I like to usually see everybody's comments, but or at least keep track of them one way or the other, but I can't seem to do that today. So Baruch Hashem, there's always a reason for everything. So Parashat Behar, from the Gutnik Chumash. It says Behar means on the mountain. Behar, mountain is Har, like Har Sinai, be the mountain of Sinai. So Behar means on the mountain, as in the verse, God spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai. The Midrash states that God chose to give the Torah on the Mount Sinai since it is the smallest of mountains, suggesting humility. This comes from Midrash Tehillim 68:9. Makes sense. There's many mountains across the world that are far more majestic, far more beautiful than Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai being in a desert area, a wilderness area on the Arabian Desert, Arabian Peninsula. It's not very pretty. It's kind of stark. It seems kind of strange that God should want to bring the Torah to such a place. Maybe he should want to bring it to some beautiful mountain in the Rockies or in the Alps or the Sierras, or maybe the tallest mountain in the world, what have you. But he decided to give it on Mount Sinai in order that it should be a sign of humility for us, which is something that we all constantly need to work on, is right, the focus on humility. We have to take Torah, we have to live a Torah life in a state of humility. Why is that so hard, by the way? A lot of people come into a Torah walk, and there is a tendency to come into such a walk and to be to get prideful. And I think the reason for that is just simply because the Torah is great wisdom. The Torah is a significant, it's the wisdom from heaven, right? So when we start walking in the wisdom from heaven, it is very easy to want to, try to get prideful in our knowledge, get prideful in our understanding, and so it's just something we have to work upon. We have to be mindful of that reality, and we have to work in humility. There's another insight, by the way, that says that the Torah was given in the wilderness in a place that was ownerless, so that no one could lay claim to it. You could not say, this Torah only belongs to a group of people. Now, it's very significant. Why? Because there is a very, very common theology that exists out there that if you're not Jewish, then you don't have to follow the Torah. Now, on the one hand, that's true, and then on the other hand, it's not true. What do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, if you're not in the covenant, then the Torah is not for you. That's what it means to be a Jew, ultimately. People think that being Jewish is a race, being Jewish is a DNA, being Jewish is you have to be born in a Jewish family, and it's really not. It's not at all. Jews are not white people with blue eyes or brown eyes. Jewish people come from every skin tone, every tribe, every tongue. Why? Because it's a covenant. The Jewish people it's a covenant. And so if you're not in the covenant, then naturally the Torah is not for you. In as much as if you're not married to a particular person, then you're not bound by those marriage obligations, right? However, if you are in covenant, then the Torah is absolutely for you. So it's really quite crazy to suggest that, well, I have a covenant with HaShem, I have a covenant with the Moshiach, but I don't abide by the covenantal rules. You can see where that would be problematic. So on the one hand, it is only for Jews, in as much as being Jewish ultimately means that you're in covenant. But on the other hand, it's not only for Jewish people, meaning that we cannot say, well, this is our precious little gift, and therefore, if you want to take part of it, you're not allowed. No, you're absolutely allowed. Now, naturally, you're allowed in as much as you come into covenant. So going back to the marriage example, you cannot have the benefits of marriage if you don't make the commitment of marriage. Hello, right? If you don't make the commitment of marriage, you cannot have the benefits of marriage. So therefore, you can't have the benefits of the Torah and the blessing of the Torah if you're not committed to the covenant, which the Torah represents. But but I should say it was given in a desolate desert place that nobody should own, so that anybody can come and possess it. It doesn't belong to anyone. Thereby, no one has the right to say you can't have it, because you know why? It doesn't belong to them. The Torah was given to us as a gift, right? It was given to us as a gift from who? HaShem. Therefore, we don't have the right to tell somebody else, you're not allowed to have it. Why? Because it's not ours to give. Now, we can tell somebody, hey, listen, if you're not in covenant, then really, here's the challenge. We can talk about those kinds of things, but you understand the point. And at the same time, we need to have a humility. We need to be humble and work on humility and strive for true humility, by the way. We need to strive for humility that is real. So it says, however, this begs the question, if God wished to give the Torah in a place that is indicative of humility, surely a valley would have been more appropriate. So even though it wasn't given on a big mountain, at least it was given on a mountain. One would think perhaps we should be given on in a valley, low. Admittedly, Sinai is the smallest of mountains, but ultimately it is still a mountain, which is hardly suggestive of lowliness and humility. I mean, it's a mountain after all. Furthermore, our parasha has become known by the name on the mountain, which without even the clarification that it's Mount Sinai, the smallest of mountains. Surely the name on the mountain alone has lost any connotation of humility of all. So if we say, hey, the Torah was given on a mountain, we are implying that it wasn't a lowly place. I mean, after all, it's Behar. The need for humility in the service of God varies according to one's level of knowledge and spiritual growth. Generally speaking, a person might fall under one of three categories, okay? Number one, a beginner. A beginner in the study and practice of Judaism has not yet trained his mindset and personality to be in harmony with the values of Judaism. Thus, at this stage, any traces of ego would prove totally counterproductive to his spiritual growth, for his ego would serve to strengthen his unrefined personality. In other words, as a beginner in the study of Torah, there's an extra effort. Well, there's going to be an extra effort in all three stages, but in the beginning stages, there needs to be, I think, an extra effort to be oh so humble. And I personally, it's been my experience that I've seen the opposite in most cases. Somebody comes in and they don't know anything about anything. They learn a bunch of stuff in, let's say, a year or two. And next thing you know, they know everything. They even know more than Jewish people. They know more than Rashi. They know more than Rambam. They know more than Ramban. They know more than anybody. You know, they know more than King David, more than King Solomon. And it's a disaster. You know, they start a website, start teaching people Torah. They've only been in Torah for a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe, and you know, it's just a disaster. You think about it like this: somebody who is born into a Jewish household, they're not even considered responsible to Torah until they reach the age of 13. 13. Now, granted, there's human growth there and wisdom and so on, but let's just point out that that's 13 years of learning. And then you're not even, according to, you know, rabbinic law, based on Torah law, you're not even eligible for punishment by the court until you reach the age of 20. So there's an additional 7 years. So once you reach the age of 13, you're considered to have your faculties about you. And you have an additional 7 years of learning before you're even held accountable by the court. This is a fact that I like to point out often, because many people think that people, you know, back in the olden days, we just drugged children out and stoned them to death if they broke the Sabbath or something like that, or anybody. We just, you know, it was so oppressive. You know, that's why Yeshua had to come, because it was so oppressive. Because you know, we had people that were just breaking the Torah left and right, and so what we would do is we would just take them out and we would just kill them. You know, it was just, if you saw your neighbor gathering sticks on the Sabbath, well, there was an easy resolution of that. You just went over there, you killed them, and then you went to synagogue, you know, and celebrated. It's just insane. But that's the way people think, right? But that's, of course, not true. No one could be given a death penalty or anything like that unless they were sitting before at least 21, the Sanhedrin Katan, 21 duly appointed qualified judges, 21. And they had to have all this due process and all this kind of stuff. And we've gone over that many times. But I just want to point out that could even happen. That wasn't even possible to even be brought before the court unless you were 20 years old. So put all that together, you have essentially 20 years of Torah learning. What a Levite didn't start his ministry until he was 33. 33. That's 33 years of Torah learning. And yet we think that we can come in and have a year or 2 or 3 of Torah under our belt, and next thing you know, we know everything. And I'm just saying, we have to be very, very careful. This is why we say at the end of our of the Aliyah, the end of our Shurim, at the end of our Drashot, we say, what do we know? What do we know? That is supposed to be a reminder that even no matter what we know, we still have a lot more that we don't know. And sometimes the more we know, the more we don't know. It's like the further you dive into the ocean, the more you realize you don't know about the ocean. So the next level. Intermediate. By the way, I pulled up the live chat on my phone here, so now I can see what you're asking. So Judith, it's absolutely okay to teach toward your 7-year-old. Absolutely. They're not too young to understand. Absolutely, you should. It's perfectly awesome to teach your little ones. Absolutely. So it says here, the intermediate. Here the person has considerably refined his personality to adhere to Jewish values and has acquired much knowledge. Therefore, while humility will still be the dominant feature of his personality, it may prove necessary on occasion for this person to use his ego to protect the interest of Judaism in general, and himself as an observant Jew in particular. Nevertheless, his ego should be carefully tempered with humility to prevent it from leading to arrogance or selfishness. So, in other words, the higher you go up in the knowledge level and proficiency level, you have a little bit more control over your faculties and so on. Nevertheless, you should always double check to make sure that you're not becoming egotistical or arrogant or selfish or what have you. Then we have the advanced. If a person has totally transformed his mind and body to want only the values of Judaism. Now, I would suggest that few people reach this level. Few people. Because look at what it's saying. Okay? If a person has totally transformed his mind and body to want only the values of Judaism, then his ego no longer possesses a threat to his relationship with God. By exercising his ego, he will only reinforce and strengthen a personality which is totally dedicated to the Torah. I don't know anybody on that level. I honestly don't. I know nobody on that level. What does this teach us? Be humble, be kind, give people the benefit of the doubt. Be strict with yourself and lenient with others. That's a concept totally rooted in Judaism that most people don't realize. That you're supposed to be strict with yourself and lenient with other people. 9 times out of 10, we get that completely reversed. We're lenient with ourselves and we're strict with other people. And I could use lots of examples of where we find that, not the least of which is when we're judging them for their sin, right? Or their failures or their faults, or, we love to just, man, that person, look at what they did, blah, blah, blah. And then we look at our own self and we go, well, I'm not that bad. And besides, I had this excuse and that excuse and this reason and that reason. And there is this circumstance and that circumstance. And we give all of these justifications, but when it comes to the other person, we're like, they're a total reprobate. We should look at the other way around. So it says, and this is why our parasha is called Behar, on the mountain, without the clarification that it is Sinai, a small mountain. The Torah is teaching us that every Jew is capable of becoming a spiritual giant whose personality is so holy that it does not need to be restrained with humility. Now, I got through saying I don't know anybody on the advanced level, and I honestly don't. But that's not to say you can't reach it. I don't know anybody personally who is, some type of star athlete, right? So they can do those incredible athletic feats that you see these professionals do. I don't know anybody personally who can do that. That doesn't mean you can't achieve it. Obviously, it can be achieved. That's the difference, So the people say, I don't like, just because we don't see anybody that can do it doesn't mean it can't be done. All right. That's the difference. And that's rarely a key difference because, as I said last week, in other theological streams, it's taught, since nobody keeps the Torah, it cannot be kept. That's a leap. Just because it isn't done doesn't mean it can't be done. If everybody's a liar, it doesn't mean that you can't help but be a liar. You see? You say, well, everybody that I know is a liar, therefore it must be impossible not to lie. No, it's not. No, it's not. And if that were the case, then you couldn't punish anybody for it. Okay, let's just look at that for a second. So if you say, well, no one can help but lie. Okay, that's not true, but let's suppose it is true. Then how can somebody be punished for being a liar? How can God punish mankind for lying if you can't help but lie? Or is it better to say everybody lies because they make a choice to lie? Not that they can't help but lie, but rather they make a choice to be liars. Therefore, punishment is justified. And there's hope that we can live a life of honesty. It's much, much more sane to make such a statement as opposed to saying you can't help but lie. Now, let's look at the introduction from the Gutna Kumash to Parasha Bechukotai. So it says here, our parasha begins by saying, if you pursue my laws, Bechukotai. So Rashi explains this means that one must toil in the study of Torah. One must toil in the study of Torah. Now, I like the way that it talks about, because it doesn't say one must study Torah, okay? But one must toil in the study of Torah. In other words, it requires effort and work. It requires the exercising of our faith. I find, and especially in our modern culture, theological culture, rarely are people encouraged to do deep Bible study. We live in a theological culture in which people are not encouraged. And it's really strange because I know some people think they are, but they're really not. They're not encouraged to really deep dive the text, to break it down, to think about it in little bites. And we're not really taught to toil in it, to really contemplate it, to think about it, to look up commentaries, to take things verse by verse. We're not taught to do that, but that's what Judaism teaches. We have to toil. It's an effort that we make. And by the way, once again, the effort is focused on us. It doesn't say we're supposed to toil others in it. We're supposed to toil in it. We're supposed to dive into it. So it says here, in other words, this does not refer to the basic requirement to observe the mitzvot, for this is mentioned in the second half of the verse, which says, guard my commandments and observe them. Rather, we learn here that in addition to basic observance, one should immerse oneself in the mitzvot with the utmost dedication. One must toil both in the study of Torah and likewise with all the other mitzvot. So the term Bechukotai represents a higher level of keeping the mitzvot, where a person uses all of his energy and concentration. Okay, so it's more than just studying the mitzvahs. It's actually really getting in there and trying to comprehend them, trying to understand them. And sometimes that's possible, and sometimes it's not possible. There are mitzvot that we can understand, there's mitzvot that we cannot understand. So it says here, to stress this point further, Hasidic thought explains that Bechukotai is a derivative of the term hakika, which means engraving. I love this insight, and I'm gonna, as soon as I read this, Bezrat Hashem, I'm gonna switch to Rabbi Monk and read another, not Rabbi Monk, Sklika, to the Kehut and read something here. So it says it means engraving. For unlike ink, which is used to write on paper, engraved words are written in stone. The words and the stone become fused into one single entity. The words and the stone become fused into one single entity. That is an extraordinarily important concept for you to understand. Bechukotai represents this concept that God's word is not written on us. It is actually engraved in us. And don't forget, by the way, that the word engraved in Hebrew, if you change one little vowel point, it's spelled the same way, but change one little vowel, it means freedom. So the word is engraved in us, and that engraved word produces freedom. Again, the exact opposite of what most people think. Most people think that the Torah brings a binding effect. It's the exact opposite. The laws of God bring freedom to us. So it says, likewise, if a person totally immerses himself in the observance of a mitzvah, he and the mitzvah are no longer two separate entities, but one. And this is how you become, Yeshua said, if you abide in me, I abide in you. How do you do that? How do you do that? Now, there's lots of little spiritual things I'm sure people could come up with, but the answer is really very spiritual and also very simple. You observe the law of God. Why? Because he is the law of God made flesh. Therefore, when you observe a mitzvah and you become one with the mitzvah because you're observing it on this deeper level, you are now abiding literally with the Messiah. So it says here, the above point that Bechukotai teaches us a lesson about observing all the mitzvahs in the best and most perfect manner in a unique quality, which we do not find by the name of any of the Parashah. Parashah Mishpatim only speaks about the rational laws. Parashah Hukat takes the name from the mitzvah, in particular the red heifer, rather than the concept of mitzvot in general. Only Parashah Bechukotai teaches us a general message about observing all the mitzvot in the best possible manner. Thus, Parashah Bechukotai is a fitting end to the book of Vayikra, a book which stresses the observance of the mitzvot more than any other book of the Torah, simply by virtue of the fact that Vayikra contains more laws and less narrative than any of the other 4 books of the Torah. Now, if we look at this insight to the Kehut Tumash, talking about engraving, this is what it says. It says, as we will note in greater detail later, this is from the Kehut Tumash introduction to Bechukotai, the fundamental meaning of Hulk is a law that we don't have a rational explanation to, which is where Hulk is found. Hulk is found in the word Bechukotai. Hulk, the meaning is chiseling. So isn't that interesting? So the laws that we don't have a seemingly rational explanation to, and the best example of that is the red heifer. That word, Hulk, means to chisel. So therefore, when we follow God's law, just because it's God's law, we don't have to have a rational explanation for it. Not that you can't have a rational explanation for it, but you don't require that. Like, I don't need somebody to say, well, why do you do that? It doesn't make sense to me, blah, blah, blah. You know what? At the end of the day, I do it because I love God and I want to walk in his paths. And it doesn't matter to me. Yes, I will always seek out a rational explanation and it'll be enlightening. It'll be It'll be intriguing. It'll be edifying. But that's not why I do it. Just like we talk about kosher eating, kosher eating really has nothing at all to do with health. It really doesn't. Now, there's some aspects of it that are healthier. Naturally, pork is nasty, and it takes your body like 9 hours to digest it, and it's full of worms and all kinds of filth. And you could make the argument that chicken is better or whatever, but it really doesn't have anything to do with health. So I don't follow the laws of kashrut because of health or because I think pork is nasty, or whatever. That's not why I do it. I do it because I don't do it because, crab is spiders. I don't do that because I do it because it's God's will. And I love him. And I want to do his will. It's just that simple. So it says, as we will note in greater detail, the fundamental meaning of hulk is chiseling or engraving, implying that through observing these types of commandments, we express our true unity with God, just as a letter is engraved on a block of stone, becomes part and parcel of that stone, and not a second discrete entity grafted onto it. Now, that's where I wanted to get to. This is where we're going to close out. And it goes on to say, grafted onto it, as is the case with a simple letter written on with ink on a parchment or paper. Now, this is where I wanted to kind of bring this home. Because many people talk about the fact that I'm grafted in. Now, we could wax eloquently about that. Because people misunderstand what it means to be grafted. There's a whole teaching about grafting that comes from the Talmud. People totally misunderstand what it means to be grafted. People think that you can be grafted into Israel and still be a Gentile, still not keep the Torah, still not live like a Jew, and still be grafted in. That is an impossibility, I'm telling you right now. It doesn't match the theme. It doesn't match Paul did not make up grafting. That's comes from one of Paul's letters about being grafted in. He didn't make that up. That was not a Paulinian revelation in the desert that he got from the Messiah. That comes from Jewish thought. Paul, I don't mean to disparage Paul at all in any way, shape, or form. I really don't. But let me just tell you that Paul wasn't very original. And I don't mean that to be negative about him at all. Okay. I'm just trying to make a point that if you actually study Paul's letters and Jewish literature, like the Talmud and the Midrash, what you find is Paul wasn't very original. He was just simply applying these concepts that he had learned and saying, you know what? I learned this in yeshiva, and that's Yeshua. I learned this from the Midrash, and that's Yeshua. I learned this from the Talmud, and that's Yeshua. That's all he was doing, which is wonderful and awesome. But it wasn't original. And so when he's talking about grafting, that was not like, wow, this new revelation that's never been known before. Now the non-Jews can be grafted into Israel. That's not by any shape or form in any way new. That's been around since Sinai, or before, actually. It's been around since Abraham and Sarah, to be quite honest. So it's quite impossible to be grafted in and to remain the same. Totally impossible. But I want to use this insight to say, if you think about the grafting thing, that's really an entry level. Because to be grafted is like a letter written with ink on a parchment or paper. That's awesome. That's wonderful. I mean, yeah, that's a Torah scroll. But I think what we do here in Lapid Judaism is we encourage people to go to the next level, which is engraving. See, it's not just about being grafted. See, people are comfortable being grafted because that's like entry level. But what we're encouraging people to do is to become engraved. Let those words, don't let them just be ink on paper. I'm talking about the fabric of your heart here. or parchment. Parchment is skin. It's paper made out of skin. Don't let it be ink on the parchment of your heart. Let it become engraved in your soul. That's the new level. But what do we know? What do we know? We are out of time, but not never actually out of content. We have a lot more to share. There's even a lot more in the introductions themselves. And God willing, we'll get to that as we're looking at these parashot and trying to understand the message from heaven to us. So thank you for being with me. It's been a pleasure to be with you this morning. I look forward to a week of learning as we close out the book of Leviticus and as we prepare to enter into the book of Bamidbar. Have a good day. May today be a day of restoration and good fortune for you. May today be a day of good news for you. May today be a day of just bright sunshine and blessing in your life. And be sure to give all the glory and all the praise to God and thank him for every breath. Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Look forward to seeing you in the morning.